So it's, again, as I mentioned, it's completely natural that, and we're designed to hold on to our lives. And George Carlin puts it this way. He says, I was hitchhiking the other day and a hearse pulled up. And I said, no thanks, I'm not going that far. That was great. You know, one definition of death is Patrick Henry's second choice, you know. So it's a given, it's part of our nervous system that rather than accepting and opening in full recognition, you know, this changing the joys and the sorrows and just saying, okay, that's just how it is. We're rigged to control, to hold on and to try to create some ground, and we do it by tightening in our body. The tension in your body is in some way, these muscles are saying, something's around the corner that's too much and I need to protect against it. What stops us from really relaxing? Dangerous. Something bad might happen and we won't be prepared. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we tighten our body, and then of course we tighten our mind. Our minds, when we're trying to control things, our minds become small and fixated, and there's this incessant inner dialogue that keeps us in that trance of something's wrong or something's going to go wrong. That's our world. And when our world's that way, there's very little space, and there's very little of that aliveness that we explored in the guided meditation. In fact, when we are in control mode, our senses are not wide open. More, the body's tight and the mind is busy, and we're not listening to the sounds of the wind or the rain or the birds or the person really that's talking to us. Not too much gets in. So what we're really exploring is this very primal and deeply ingrained reflex in the face of impermanence, in the face of loss, to keep doing. Having our body hold on tight, our mind churning, our behaviors, we stay busy. And the more stressed, the more it feels busy for most people, unless we're in complete freeze. So this ego activity gives us a sense. When we're doing, we feel a little better than just facing the impermanence, because there's some part of us that feels like if we're doing something, there's some control. It gives an illusory sense of control when we keep on doing things. And yet, as we kind of intuit, when our lives are organized around this kind of fear-based, egoic doing, we're in a trance where we really can't sense being. As I mentioned, the senses aren't awake, there's not a quality of in the moment at all. And you can check it out. If you look at a day where you've been stressed and trying to control or manage or make it through, you'll notice that there were very few moments where there was a sense of savoring, where there's a sense of wonder, where there's a visceral sense of love. Why? When we're in fear-based egoic doing, we're cut off from really the deep qualities of being that are really most our essence. That love, that awareness, we're cut off. Not really cut off, but we're not aware of being in touch. So one of our challenges is, because as I mentioned, this is the quickest reflex we have when there's stress, is to go into fight, flight, and do something versus relax, open, and try to touch what's here. That reflex is very, very quick, and the more stressed we are, the more quickly we go into defense or aggression. So the very moments in our life, and I'm bringing us back to what I was saying about some of the people at Palouse, where it's really out of our hands. Somebody's died, somebody's dying, we just got the diagnosis ourselves, our house is been done in, our child is, having a major struggle. Now, clearly there's things, practical things we can do, and we do the best we can. But on some level, it's out of our hands. And what we most need to do is open to that. Instead, we do the opposite. We get tighter, more busy, more defended, more aggressive, more down on ourselves, more down on others. We go the opposite direction. So the real inquiry is, how do we turn around that conditioning? How do we turn towards presence and awareness rather than tighten into fight-flight? That's really the inquiry we keep encountering over and over again. Maybe just to clarify one thing that I think comes up a lot, which is when I talk about not controlling, when I talk about seizing from all the managing, I'm not talking about inactivity. The process of shifting out of the egoic fight-flight is a process of coming into presence with what's here, and then from that presence responding. In the Zen tradition they say responding appropriately. That the whole path is responding appropriately rather than from an egoic reactivity. When we respond appropriately, we're responding from our deepest intelligence. We're responding from our heart. One of my favorite examples of this, Tom Wolfe wrote, in his book he wrote about in the 1950s, these highly trained pilots in the U.S. Air Force, and they were set for this life-death task of flying at the highest altitudes that had ever been attempted before. So they were going beyond the Earth's denser atmosphere. And what they found is that, and this was to their horror, was that the laws of normal aerodynamics no longer applied out there. So all the ways they would normally fly didn't work. This is in The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. And the plane could skid and into a flat spin. It was like a cereal bowl, he says, on wax formica counter, and then start tumbling. Not spinning and diving, but tumbling end over end. So it was whacked out trying to fly out there. And what they would do when it went out of control is they would get frantic and try to stabilize by applying correction after correction. This is the pilots. And the more furiously they manipulated the controls, the wilder the ride would become. So then they would start screaming helplessly into the intercom saying, I've tried X, I've tried Y, I've tried Z, what do I do next? And they would be screaming this as they were plunging to their deaths. So this tragic drama occurred a number of times until one pilot, and this was Chuck Yeager, inadvertently struck upon the solution. So when his plane started tumbling, he got knocked unconscious. He wasn't trying to control anything. He just was knocked unconscious. The plane pummeled it towards Earth. When it re-entered the planet's denser atmosphere, he came to, and that's when the classical navigational strategies could be reemployed, and he, steadied the craft and he landed safely. So he discovered the one life-saving response, the only life-saving response he could do, and it's don't do anything. You take your hands off the controls. This is Wolfe. He says, it's the only choice you have, and it counters all training and even basic survival instincts, but it works. So, I'd like to say the same goes in spiritual life, which is that when things feel like they are totally out of control, let them be. Take the hands off the control. All our normal strategies of fight, flight will only, like those frantic pilots, mostly our strategies take place in this spinning of our mind that is trying to battle against how it is, that's trying to solve it, to fix it, to make it go away. When it's out of control, take the hands off the controls. Now, you don't do what Chuck Yeager did necessarily. It's not getting knocked unconscious, It's actually coming into consciousness, like, okay, what's going on in this moment, and now this moment, and this moment. It takes courage. Because as I mentioned, trying to control things gives us a sense that maybe we're going to be on top of it. But it's a false sense. In fact, the only refuge in those moments is to take the hands off the controls, come into presence, and then, as we really inhabit presence, there will be an intuitive way to respond to our world that most serves. If I had you take some time to reflect on different situations in your life, you would know the difference between the egoic doing that occupies the swaths of time where we're really tense and tight and on our way somewhere and trying to get things done and trying to get other people to do things a certain way, and there's just a tightness. We know the difference between that and the moments where there's some sense of what's called being in the zone, where it's not so much of a self-doing, it's kind of we are responding and engaged with the currents. And, there's a sensitivity and a sense that the universe is doing it. We're being guided in some way. Yet, as most of us know, the egoic activity is what's most familiar. We get some satisfaction. It's temporary. This is the thing with false refuges, is you do get a little bit of a benefit, so it keeps you hooked. Like, we cross things off the list, and we get a temporary sense of relief that lasts about 2.7 seconds, and then back we are to the next thing on the list. But there's a sense of, well, I'm doing this because I want to get my way, and we get our way, and that feels like a success, although we've won the battle and lost the war when we get our way with other people. We might, get the temporary benefit of feeling like we've prepared or defended against an attack or some damage. We might feel like we our wile got us through some terrible circumstances. My favorite damage control story is of a young man working in a supermarket. Some of you might remember, he's in the produce section, and this older guy says he wants to buy a half a head of lettuce. So the guy goes into the back room and he says to his manager, some jerk wants to buy a half a head of lettuce. And then he realizes the guy's standing right behind him. And he said, and this gentleman kindly has offered to buy the other half. So the manager's pretty impressed. Later on in the day, he finds this employee and he says, I really liked the way you handled that. That was pretty cool. I was impressed the way you got yourself out of that situation. We like people who think on their feet. Where are you from, son? The young man says, from Canada. Why'd you leave Canada? The manager says, well, the young guy replies, there's nothing but whores and hockey players up there. Really, said the manager. My wife is from Canada. Really? Who did she play for? So there, we get certain benefits from having an ego that's quick on its feet, so to speak. The truth is that we will continue, and as we all know, having an ego that's a well-functioning ego is part of the equipment we need to survive on planet Earth. The question is, are we identified with it? Do we know how to draw on who we are that's beyond the ego? And we will only begin to step out of the unhealthsome egoic doing when we recognize the suffering that's there. When we start to really get how much our obsessive thinking is keeping us from connecting with ourselves or connecting with others. When we get how our blaming is creating separation. When we get how our defensiveness is stopping us from really discovering something that might be true. We begin to open up. And there are some zones that can become very clear when we're in control mode and realize this is really causing pain. One of them is, when we start recognizing how we are in some way trying to control our experience of another person dying, of our own, or of our own mortality. I remember one woman that I was in touch with, and I wrote about this in True Refuge, was struggling and fighting valiantly to keep her husband alive. They had tried everything, and he was clearly dying. But when he mentioned it to her, her response that particular day was, "Oh, darling, don't talk about that right now. You're having a good day." After she said that, she felt this big gap between them. She realized she had created distance in her denial. And her prayer was to please let me be present with what's true. Let me just love him through this, not deny what's happening. So that's a form of control, is denying the pain that's here, denying the loss, not being willing to name it or say it. And we start seeing that, or perhaps our way of dealing with mortality is anger or bargaining or any of the classic ways that we try to stay in charge. We start noticing that and realize that we're losing a precious opportunity to be more intimate with ourselves or a loved one. Another way that it might become apparent is if we're fighting aging, because we'll lose, I promise. But we can see it, that there's a sense of the insult of aging and feeling beleaguered by it and struggling to try to keep your body, your mind, your way of being looking different than it is, and in some level sensing something's wrong. Okay, that's the control, this judging and striving. And there can be a sense of that is getting in the way of living the moments. We can see it not as clearly when there's controlling addictive behavior. It's like, well, I've got to control this. It's going to do me in. I see it a lot with overeating. And yet the control mechanism is usually self-blame, or punishment, or restriction, which I found always leads to fuel more addiction. Controlling only temporarily gives us a sense that something's working. It backfires. And see it with controlling difficult emotions in our hearts, that we either deny that we're suffering, or we in some way try to fix it, try to make it go away, rather than just be with. Take the hands off the controls. Now, one of the big places we go into trance is controlling each other, and that is the place that often needs the most attention. Can we stop expecting others to be the way we want them to be? Can we stop trying to make others cooperate with our idea of how they should behave? So we begin to see the ego strategies of how we withdraw our affections, or we threaten, or we punish, and get the suffering. This is getting in the way of intimacy. These lives are short. You can see it with partners, the rules we have, and parents, the way they use, guilt to try to create a certain behavior, and how it backfires into resentment. One little girl was sitting watching her mother do the dishes at the kitchen sink, and she suddenly noticed her mother had several strands of white hair sticking out in contrast to her brunette head. She looked at her mom and inquisitively asked, "Why are some of your hairs white, Mom?" And her mother replied, "Well, every time that you do something wrong and make me cry or unhappy, one of my hairs turns white." Little girl thought about this revelation for a while and said, "Mommy, how come all of grandma's hairs are white.